If Alger Hiss's life seemed like a stately progress towards perfection, Chambers was a zigzagging, god-awful mess, but always in search of a higher truth. It's going to take longer to tell than Hiss's because it was much more complicated and I think much more interesting. I've already described his sad, sick family. Chambers escaped from it by immersing himself in 19th century romantic novels, especially Dostoevsky and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. His hygiene was so poor that his schoolmates called him chamberpot and stinky. He was so physically clumsy that he couldn't even play marbles. He ran away from home for 2 years in his mid-teens, but by the end of high school in 1919, his brilliance won him the position of class valedictorian. His valedictory speech was unforgettable because in it he predicted that one of his female classmates would become a prostitute. Even as a boy, he managed to sort of rise high in organizations and then break the rules in some scandalous way. Later that same year, he ran away from home again and lived in New Orleans' French Quarter in a rooming house where his next-door neighbor was a prostitute named One-Eyed Annie. Chambers returned north and entered into Williams College in 1920. He skipped a gathering of the freshman class, staying instead in his room reading the Bible. And he left Williams after a few days because he said it was too high class for him. His roommate for his brief time there said that Chambers later sent him some very strange letters whose contents were never disclosed. Chambers enrolled in Columbia University in Upper Manhattan in New York and quickly developed a reputation there as a great writer of poetry and prose. Among the people he met there, many of whom became his lifelong friends and admirers, these were mostly his classmates, were Meyer Shapiro, later a Columbia professor and in many opinions the greatest art historian of the 20th century, two future poets, Louis Zukofsky and the black gay poet Langston Hughes, the great liberal thinker and later Columbia professor Lionel Trilling and his wife Diana, who was one of our country's great ladies of letters, the middlebrow cultural maven Clifton Fadiman, and the philosopher Mortimer Adler. That's quite a collection of college chums. Somewhere along the line, Chambers became fluent in French and German and gained a good deal of ease with as many as 9 other languages, depending on who you talk to, including Chinese and Russian, most of them self-taught. His faculty advisor at Columbia was Mark Van Doren, and said that Chambers was the best of all the undergraduates that he had in the 1920s. I'm sure there was a lot of competition for that title. Van Doren and some others said later that the great tragedy of Chambers' life was that he left literature to get involved in politics, and that had he stuck with literature, he could have become one of the great writers of his generation. Well, you may recall that people said of Alger Hiss that he was so physically graceful you might think he was the British ambassador. Lionel Trilling later recalled Chambers' physical appearance in the early 1920s. This is a rather long quote. The moral force that Chambers asserted began with his physical appearance. This seemed calculated to negate youth and all its graces, to deny that they could be of any worth in our world of pain and injustice. He was short of stature and very broad, with heavy arms and massive thighs. His sport was wrestling. His eyes were narrow, and they preferred to consult the floor rather than his interlocutor's face. When the mouth opened, it never failed to shock by reason of the dental ruin it disclosed, a devastation of empty sockets and blackened stumps. That desolated mouth was the perfect insignia of Chambers' moral superiority. It annihilated the hygienic American present. Only a serf could have such a mouth, or some student in visored cap who sat in his Moscow garret and thought of nothing save the moment when he would toss the fatal canister into the barouche of the Grand Duke. Well, Chambers became editor-in-chief of the student literary publication, The Morningside, and it published a play that he wrote called A Play for Puppets, and it's about Jesus Christ moments before the resurrection on Easter morning. It portrays Jesus in his tomb as a world-weary, long-haired redhead dressed in a gray kimono, wanting to remain dead, pleading with God not to bring him back to life, and finally, very reluctantly, being brought back to life. Well, one of the New York newspapers labeled the play blasphemous, and there was a public scandal. In those days, you could get kicked out of Columbia for blaspheming Jesus. And Chambers withdrew, rather than be expelled, from the university in 1922. The next year, he and his pal Meyer Shapiro traveled around Western Europe and saw the continent still recovering from the suicide attempt of World War I. And Chambers slowly became convinced that society as we know it was doomed, would die a violent death, and after enormous bloodshed would be succeeded by some new paradise. And he eventually decided that that would be a communist paradise. He got back into Columbia in 1924 by lying to the dean and saying that he wanted to teach history, but he dropped out without completing a single semester. Chambers and his younger alcoholic brother began frequenting working-class bars in Long Island, where he sang the Communist Party anthem, the Internationale, with dock workers in several languages. And he was swept away and joined the party. He began regular attendance at meetings in 24, got his card in 25. And as an amateur psychologist, it seems to me that Chambers had found a new family and a cause. The party was a place of commitment and action, unlike studying in college, which he no longer wanted to do. And it was a way to escape from his horrible, chaotic family life. His grandmother was becoming violently psychotic, swinging a knife in the air to ward off evil spirits, and his brother was tending towards the suicide that he achieved in 1926, finally. Chambers joined the Communist Party in New York long before it was chic for a few Hollywood types and intellectuals. It was an explicitly revolutionary organization in the 1920s. It made no attempt to be seen as a normal American political party. It was also overwhelmingly proletarian and foreign-born. Most of its members didn't speak English very well. And Chambers, an outsider who had been to college and liked books, had a hard time fitting in. But it would be an understatement to say that he joined the party. After his brother's suicide, he made the party his life. Lionel Trilling wrote that Chambers was the first person I ever knew whose commitment to radical politics was meant to be definitive of his whole moral being, the controlling element of his existence. And he eventually became a top editor of the party's newspaper, the Daily Worker. Well, in 1929, there was a factional fight within the Communist Party. The faction that Chambers belonged to lost, and he dropped out of the party for about 2 years. But he remained a communist and wrote short stories that were published in communist magazines all over the world. The muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens wrote Chambers, "Whenever I hear people talking about proletarian art and literature, I'm going to ask them to shut their minds and look at you." Chambers also established himself as a translator of German and French literature into English, by the way. In 1931, he married a woman whose maiden name was Esther Shemitz, and this was a time when marriages between Christians and Jews were extremely rare. And also in 1931, Chambers was asked and agreed to return to the party and become editor of the New Masses, which was the party's literary magazine. His time there was very short, though, only a few months. In the spring of 1932, he was tapped on the shoulder, and the party told him, "We have a new job for you. You're going into the underground. You're going to do secret work for the Soviet Union." And Chambers obeyed the summons. He was a good party member, and he went to work for the fourth branch of the GRU, Glavnaya Razvyadivatelnoye Upravlenie, the Soviet Army's military intelligence agencies. Now, there were lots of secret Soviet agencies over the years I'm going to be talking about, and Chambers worked for the GRU. But just to keep things simple, I'm going to use the better-known term KGB to refer to all the activities. In his first 2 years there, Chambers was a courier, carrying envelopes around New York City, getting documents photographed. I think he must have done translating to keep from going crazy from the boredom of that kind of job. Chambers and his wife had their first child, who was a daughter in 1933. And early in the spring of 1934, the underground tapped him on the shoulder again and said, "We're reassigning you to work in Washington." He commuted between there and New York City and finally moved to Baltimore in August 1934. The reason for this was that President Roosevelt's New Deal was hiring bright young men from Harvard and other top universities and putting them into its new economic regulatory agencies. A few of them were communist in sentiment, as some had even joined the party secretly. I think the attraction of communism to these people was that when the rebellion against the ruling classes won and the workers' dictatorship is being established, you need lots of plans, 5-year plans, farm plans, healthcare plans, urban plans. And the guys from Harvard, Yale, and Columbia and Princeton are the geniuses in the capital who are going to be writing those plans, all for the benefit of the peasants, of course. Now, the party had organized these young recruits, and it appears there were like 50 or 60 of them, into cells, and they were all told, keep your head down, avoid the slightest impression there's anything remotely left-wing about you, and try to rise through the ranks, try to get out of the alphabet soup agencies and into the cabinet bureaus like Treasury and Justice and State. And someday, perhaps years hence, you will be told to do something to tilt policy of the United States to favor the Soviet Union. Now, the leaders of these cells and one or two others met about once a week in one of their apartments, kind of a communist chat group. They mostly discussed matters of public policy from the party's point of view. They also handed over the party dues. And Chambers' job was to attend to this group of cell leaders. He once described himself as their morale officer, because when at some point in their early history the people in the group were coming up with a list of fringe benefits for peach pickers. It appears they called themselves the Cling Peaches. The group later came to be called the Ware Group because its guiding spirit was an open party member named Harold Ware. He'd spent some of the 1920s working in the Soviet Union on the collectivization of agriculture there, a process in which the Soviet government starved to death or violently killed millions of its own citizens. Great training experience. And Ware hung around the New Deal alphabet soup agencies, especially the AAA, which is where Hiss worked in 33 and 34. Now, there's no doubt that this group existed. It met from time to time at one member's home near the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Washington in a back street called St. Matthew's Court. If you've ever been there, it's about as close to Greenwich Village as you get here in Washington. It appears the Ware Group's members also did some document stealing from the government and passing on to the Soviet Union, although I don't understand what information they would have that the Soviet Union would want. I can't imagine anybody in Moscow being interested in fringe benefits for peach pickers. Maybe it was just to get them into the habit of passing paper. One member of the group, a man named Nathaniel Weil, testified that Hiss was a member of it in the first half of 34. Chambers said many times that when he began working in Washington in 34, Hiss was already a member. Well, slightly earlier than Chambers showed up, Hiss had left the AAA and went to the Senate committee. Back to Chambers. He and his wife had their second child, a son, in 1936. And then in 1937, they tapped him on the shoulder again, and he moved into much darker activities. He left the Ware Group and became the head of a spy ring in Washington. We're not just in some communist chat group now. We're now talking about espionage. The spokes of the ring were several people in the State and Treasury departments, one each at the Aberdeen Proving Ground for the Army and one in the National Bureau of Standards. Each of these men gave Chambers documents about once every 10 days or 2 weeks, knowing that their ultimate destination was Moscow. Usually, Chambers would have the documents photographed, pass the films up the line that he knew ended in Moscow, and would return the documents, the original documents, to the government men a few hours later or the following morning. And it seems that just about when Chambers began this spying in early 37, he began to get disillusioned with communism and the whole life he was leading. And I think there were several reasons. First, he became genuinely disillusioned with communism in action, because what he saw in the party in real life was just endless backstabbing, and the party was a complete flop in this country as a popular party, and what it was creating at home was a poverty-stricken dictatorship. Second, sometime in the mid-30s, he had some kind of a spiritual awakening, triggered, he said, by his marveling at the delicacy and intricacy of his baby daughter's ears. He wrote, "Those ears were not created by any chance coming together of atoms in nature," the communist view. "They could have been created only by immense design. Design presupposes God." And to Chambers, belief in God excluded communism. Third, and this is just speculation, I think Chambers must have felt that the quality of his life, his daily life, was hopelessly unsatisfactory. He generally worked by night and slept by day, and he went around under 5 different names, none of which was his real name, and he said he couldn't tell his wife what he did for a living, and they had no social life. And he was a skilled writer, linguist, editor, and yet he was employed essentially as a messenger boy and committing a major felony. He was living in near poverty in a dingy apartment in a poor neighborhood in Baltimore. One of the places he lived in Baltimore, the ground floor was the local office of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and there were drunks passed out, draped over the front steps, and prostitutes walking up and down in front of the place. I suspect it's one thing to take on that kind of sacrifice when you're 25 and single, and another to carry on with it when you're getting towards 40 and you have a wife and 2 kids and you want to buy nice things, which he would never have as long as he remained a communist worker. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the late 1930s, Chambers feared for his life. The Stalin purges had reached communist parties in countries other than the Soviet Union, and including the Communist Party here. And Chambers, remember, had not been a faithful Stalinist all along, and deviationists like him were starting to be murdered, in some cases in this country, or to disappear, or to be summoned to Moscow for consultations from which they never returned. Chambers himself was summoned to Moscow in July 1937, and he used a lot of excuses to stay in the United States. And it says something about communism in the Soviet Union that Chambers feared death not at the hands of the government of this country, which he had been betraying, but at the hands of the cause to which he devoted his whole life. Well, Chambers planned his exit with enormous care, and he was very smart to do that. I suspect that if you're part of a spy ring for a foreign government and they learn that you're about to defect, your life expectancy is quite short. But he got a job under his own name in the government at a place called the National Research Project. He lined up some translating work with the Oxford University Press. He got a car, more on that later. And all this took several months, during which he continued to seem a loyal underground functionary. Then one day, and later he pinpointed it as April 15th, 1938, Chambers got into the new car with his wife and kids and drove away. They lived for a while in Daytona, Florida. Staying at a motel there, Chambers slept by day and translated by night with a gun next to him, as his wife slept nearby with a hatchet under her pillow. Murray Kempton, who himself was briefly in the communist youth, wrote that the great attraction of communism and its greatest evil is that it takes away the sense of personal sin. You can see millions killed and lose no sleep because they're priests or farmers who won't join the collective, and their deaths are necessary deaths. Kempton thought that a man who thinks that the night manager of a Florida hotel in 1938 is a KGB agent who's going to kill him is not fleeing a mere enemy of flesh and blood. He is fleeing the reappearance in his life of a sense of personal sin, from which the whole world was not wide enough to offer him shelter. Those are Kempton's words, not mine. Shortly after Chambers' disappearance, of course, the KGB realized that he'd stopped showing up for work, and they sent an open member of the Communist Party, one Grace Hutchins, to see Mrs. Chambers' brother, who was a Manhattan lawyer named Reuben Shemitz. Miss Hutchins left Shemitz with a phone number, which he called. A female voice on the other end told him that Chambers returning to the communist movement was a matter of life or death, and that if Shemitz would tell the party where Chambers was, no harm would come to Chambers' wife and children. Miss Hutchins, by the way, had been one of the 2 witnesses at Chambers' marriage. Witness to your marriage, 6 years later she sets up a death threat. Well, let us leave Whittaker Chambers there for a moment at the so far low point in his life. His thrills and spills were far from over, and we'll resume in the next video.